I feel very humbled that I am being asked to speak on this subject, being flanked by two former cabinet secretaries. It's a daunting task, carrying coal to Newcastle. You people have been in the thick of it. You know it firsthand. I, as a media person, have a second-hand version of it. So if I am wrong on certain points, please bear with me, but my purpose in this presentation will be to present the big picture as I see it. I claim no expertise in administration, nor am I a psychologist to enter the minds of Indian political class, which, as Mr. Prabhat Kumar just now pointed out, is a mosaic of good and bad. I'm very uncomfortable reading out from written text that impedes natural impulse and thinking on one's feet. I think administration is also a lot of thinking on one's feet because the kind of challenges that come need immediate attention, and most of the problems get aggravated for lack of adequate quick response. Let's try this thinking on the feet. I have had the good fortune learning some bit of administration and the way politics works in this country, sitting at the feet of some of the old guard on either side of the divide, because there is, as Mr. Prabhat Kumar said, a divide today, while there should be none. In 1989, I remember, that was the year of the centenary of Pandit Nehru. And we decided in the newspaper I used to then work for as to how to make our readers interested in the phenomenon that was Nehru. Because tomes have been written on his work and on his achievements, on his personality. And we would have to add value to that while factoring in the the attention span of our readers, because one problem that we have in this country today is that we are dealing with a generation which is increasingly brought up on television and not as much on serious inquiry or books, reading of books. In fact, I remember Henry Kissinger made this remark about the United States. He was here to deliver a lecture, and Professor Babani Sen Gupta asked him as to why is it that the American policy with regard to South Asia is often seen as flawed by us in South Asia. He said, look, we have a problem in our country. We are dealing with a generation that isn't brought up on books, it's brought up on the lesser techniques of learning. And because our policies are influenced by the latest Gallup poll, that we are more prone to error. Now, that's simply put, but it's a very complex scenario. And it's as much today available in India than it was at that point of time in the United States. So, we decided to anecdotally tell about Nehru. And those, in '89, Mr. Huxer was alive, so was Mr. Ramnath Kao. And there was a graceful lady called Bimla Sindhi. She used to be the housekeeper at Teen Murthy, when she used to stay there. So my first call was on Mr. Huxer. I remember that he used to stay in Vasant Vihar, and it was very hot those days. So on one very warm afternoon, I knocked at his door. By that time, he was beginning to lose his eyesight. He let me in because I had gone there with an appointment, and he placed himself on a rocking chair, and I was sitting on another chair next to him. And I gave the purpose of my visit. I said, sir, we want to use anecdotes to reintroduce Panditji to the people. I mean, it was almost like Munna Bhai Lage Raho, It was almost that approach, which came much later. to reintroduce Gandhi. And I think these techniques at times work because Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan reinvented Qawwali to make it relevant to the younger generation. So he first of all, he was livid with me. He says, what joke are you playing on me? You want me to encapsulate that rich life, that towering persona in a couple of anecdotes. It's impossible. It's an insult to his memory. I said, sir, no, sir, it's not an insult to his memory. We are celebrating his memory. We want to commemorate his memory. And we, in journalism, have a way of telling things. So we are storytellers, basically. We are neither historians, we are neither academics. Anyway, I could persuade him. And once he allowed himself to be persuaded, he took my guest recorder in his hand and started speaking, his eyes shut. I must say that I'll relate the story to you, but when I went back to my office and I transcribed it on the typewriter, I didn't have to change a comma or a full stop. His pauses, long and small and short, told me all. He said that I used to be GIS External Publicity in the Ministry of External Affairs, and on a languid afternoon, a BBC staffer barged into my room, very distraught, very upset to look at. He said, I need your help. I asked him what it is about. He says, you know, I was traveling in Orissa, and I happened to take some photographs, some pictures of a tribal woman feeding her child. And those images have been confiscated first by the state government, and that confiscation has been endorsed by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. And I think it's unfair, it's stifling the freedom of speech. Aksar was on the side of the BBC correspondent. He was in no time on the line with Mr. Keshkar, then Minister for Information and Broadcasting. And he tried to reason with him. Mr. Keshkar wouldn't allow himself to be persuaded. He said, those were different days, Mr. Sharma. Even the Prime Minister was a phone call away. I was on the line with Pandit Nehru. I told him there was a problem. First, because there has been an error of judgment on the ground, and it has been compounded because there is a difference of perception between me and the Minister of Information and Broadcasting. He says, why don't you come across? So he says, I walked across to the Prime Minister's office. He said, I told the story to the Prime Minister, and luckily for me, the Prime Minister was also on my side. He was on the line in no time with Mr. Keshkar. He said, Keshkar, this is Jawaharlal here. I am told that you think that a woman feeding her child is lurid and obscene. I was told you've been educated at Sorbonne. I thought you were a man. You had a level of consciousness. I think a mother feeding her child is the most noble image that we can send out of this country, regardless of whether that mother is poor or rich. Release the photographs, and he put down the receiver. This was the age of innocence, ladies and gentlemen. And I have given you one example. I then went to Mr. Ramnath Kaur. Mr. Kaur, you know, he also was in Visant Vihar, I think. And he used to have a study which used to overlook his living room. And we were ushered into his study. I had a photographer with me. And in his study there was a very old radio set like there. And, you know, some image of a horse carved in wood. And And you know, the general ambience I got, I thought, you know, this is something straight out of the pages of Sherlock Holmes, you know. I was a young fellow, you know, coming face to face with Ramnath Kao, the super spook. Very few people. In fact, I remember that when there was a, and Mr. Kaushal would bear me out, when there was a hold-up in South Avenue or North Avenue, where MP was held hostage by some left-wing activist from Jharkhand mines, you know, one MP called Dalbir Singh, if I don't forget his name, and he was overpowered by an officer of the Delhi police. And that's the first time I saw Mr. Ramnath Kaur in flesh and blood, all white, very tall man, unlike the present-day RNAW officers who, perhaps are even seen on television, but he was very rare to be seen. So we contacted him because he was in charge of the Naini jail when Panditji was imprisoned there. Later, he had the good fortune of working with them. And he had a long chat with me, and during that conversation, he told me, you know, there is a much mistaken belief that Pandit Nehru was a romanticist about China. He says the first IG's conference that he addressed, the first ever, he told us in a closed door session that though we may perceive Pakistan to be a bigger danger, but the real threat to us shall come from China. That's what Mr. Kaur told me. I was not aware of it until then. And then various kind of other anecdotes and all. And while I was about to leave, and in the in-between, you know, he was not keeping good health, so he had to use his washroom pretty often between this conversation. And each time he'd go to the loo, some fellow will come from somewhere, appear from nowhere to stand and watch on us. So it was very exciting talking to him. And he threw an envelope while I was leaving. He said, you know, I keep on getting these clippings of newsletter, letters to the editor, which various people write, and and this is, you would like to go through it. When I came out and I read those letters, and those letters were all about, people being circumspect and skeptical about Rajiv Gandhi's proposed visit to China. That was 18. Now I came out. He didn't tell me. He just told me two stories, and I used my, it was an intelligent guess that I linked them, the two together, and I deciphered the message the old man had given me, that he was not on the side of the Prime Minister going to China at that point in history. These were men of substance. They weren't men of straw. They used to tell big stories briefly and even without uttering a word. And there was no way that the leadership of the time would not have listened to them or not respected them. Now cut that to the age of manipulation. This is the age of innocence. Let's come to the age of manipulation. There was an unfortunate incident where Foreign Secretary was sacked publicly in response to a question by a correspondent from Pakistan. I was a great admirer, and still I am in some ways, of Mr. Rajiv Gandhi. But I think that was one mistake, one blunder. He could have been better off having not committed. I happened to meet Mr. Venkateshwar consequent to that episode. And I asked him that what was wrong. So he gave me a couple of instances which I'll recount. He said that once there was a meeting convened by the Prime Minister's office, attended by the then Principal Secretary, the very erudite, very cerebral Mr. Gopi Arora, and also by Mrs. Sarla Krema and a couple of other people. And the Foreign Secretary was there. The issue under discussion was appointment of ambassadors. And a proposal came from the Prime Minister's office to appoint a retired general as ambassador to one of the countries, perhaps it was Germany. He says when they first discussed it amongst themselves as if I wasn't there, and then they asked me as to what I thought of it. And he said, Mr. Sharma, I thought I'll rather in that difficult situation resort to some light-hearted banter. So he said that appointing a general as an ambassador is fine with me, sir, so long as you're open to appointing a diplomat as a general. No, in his assessment, the Prime Minister understood the joke, but not his advisors from the civil services. They perhaps interpreted that as an act of defiance. And there was a slight downhill between the equation of the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister's office. And we all know that the Prime Minister's office has always had, for many years now, a major stake in foreign policy, regardless of who is the External Affairs Minister. And that was a problem. So when he was sacked publicly, I met him again, because we had heard about this problem earlier. He is, and in retrospect only proved that he had a great sense of humor, Mr. Venkatesh. I said, sir, can I come and see you? He said, yes, of course, Mr. Sharma, you are welcome to see me. I am lying in state and you can file past me. I wonder that the present day civil servants, how many of them have that kind of a sense of humor and that kind of conviction in their own abilities to stand up and be counted in a minority of one. And this ability is required in, ladies and gentlemen, you'd agree, in every sphere of life. More so in the political sphere. Perhaps relatively less amongst bureaucrats. Because as a former Home Secretary coming from the state of Bihar, I won't name him because I don't have his permission, and this is a comment that he made on one of his successors who has recently joined a political party without even almost immediately, kind of within months. I asked him, sir, what do you have to say about this? He says that, in the best of times, and perhaps also in the worst of times, the relationship between a minister and his secretary has to be spousal, in the sense that the wife can question the husband without fearing divorce. I thought it was pretty close to the truth, that this relationship has to have a degree of commitment, minus subjugation or total submission. It's a very tenuous, this kind of relationship is a very tenuous relationship to pursue, but it must be attempted, I suppose, for good governance, for perfect communication between the engine and the wheels. Engine is the elected representative, the wheels are the bureaucracy. The Prime Minister otherwise wouldn't have mentioned the outgoing Prime Minister in his very first address at the ramparts of the Red Fort. His concern was the delivery system. And what is the delivery system? The delivery system is the bureaucracy. The captains of that team are many of the people who they have been the captains of the team. And then the lower bureaucracy and the provincial bureaucracy. And there used to be a time, I remember, that when a senior IS official or an IPS officer at the center or in the state spoke to his subordinate at the district level, he was shown as much deference as was shown to the minister in charge. Because a bureaucrat, in my view, is a more complete administrator than a politician. The politician brings what value to the table is that the politician is expected to be in good knowledge of what is required at the grassroots. A politician is a good pathologist. He knows what is the problem. And a bureaucrat is the man who prescribes the medicine. And unless there is a perfect coordination between these two, you will lead into a situation which was so vividly brought out in that great book called The Final Diagnosis, where a man is lying on the deathbed. The pathologist is an old-style pathologist whose report is not coming, and the doctor is waiting and waiting and waiting to decide the course of treatment. And by the time the report comes, the patient is dead. So I think for the final diagnosis to happen quickly requires a chemistry between these two entities. Now, many years ago, there was a shooting incident at the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy. Where a young probationer had taken out a revolver and shot some bullets in the air. And there, one thing I heard, Mr. P.S. Appu perhaps was then the director of the academy. And Mr. P.S. Appu, all of you would know him for his very stellar quote, so to speak. I mean, at least I remember him for that quote. He says I met him, he says, Mr. Sharma, the Indian Administrative Service is the Indian Automatic Service. This surely proves that what Mr. Prabhat Kumar says, to keep the system going amid political convulsions. That's what these people do. You all have done all your life. But now, it has become the Indian Navigated Service. It's navigated by circumstances. It's navigated by vested interests. And it's navigated, unfortunately, also by personal greed, the lust for the riches that are abounding around us in this age of liberalized economy, where resources are there, but they are there in the hands of a few, and they are not being honestly, equitably distributed. But this situation is not sustainable, because I think the ground rules have changed in recent years. You know what Lohia used to say earlier, कि जिंदा कौमें 5 बरस इंतजार नहीं किया करती, वो आज के दिन नजर आ रहा है. A whole lot of legislations may be brought grudgingly, half-heartedly, under whatever compulsions or circumstances, seem to be preparing a climate where the elected executive and the steel frame, as Sardar Patel called them, has to be in consonance with each other. They can't anymore afford to be working at cross purposes. The right to information. You see, there are 3 things. Theodore Roosevelt once said that when there is a roll call in the Senate, the senators want to know whether they should say present or not guilty. This is one Theodore Roosevelt quote. Juxtaposition it with what Kennedy said, that communism has never come to power in a country that was not disrupted by war or corruption or both. And there is a third one, by the lead singer of the band called Nirvana, Kurt Cobain, who said, the duty of the youth is to challenge corruption. All three things are happening together in the countryside. The terrain has to alter. The process has started. The right to information. As they say, information is power. And once that information is available to the people, it leads to an empowered public opinion, which makes democracy robust. Because when an empowered electorate goes to the polling booth, he is swayed not as much by emotion as by reason. And democracy in India has to be reason-based if this country has to succeed and if this system has to succeed. You cannot, at the time of election, disturb the equanimity of mind of the Indian voter to capture his mandate. And in fact, I have often said, and many people have dismissed this as a utopian dream, that the Election Commission should also look at this. That whether there exists in this country a situation where a voter shall go to the polling station with equanimity of mind, and how shall that equanimity of mind be achieved or bequeathed to the voter?